Normally, I would say something funny or random before starting the video, but this time, no. JCNU Xatu is a legend, and I do not want to disrespect his legacy. Xatu is the definition of the modern JCNU metagame. There is not a single Pokemon who can match Xatu's dominance, importance, and influence in the metagame. Period. Xatu is unanimously agreed to be the best Pokemon in the metagame, and is always the most used Pokemon in tournaments by a wide margin. Xatu is so good that it's recommended you use it on every single team, with very few exceptions. While you don't have to use Xatu on every team, it's so incredible that you don't really have a reason to drop it. Xatu provides so much offensive and revenge killing utility, as well as some minor defensive utility. It is a universal revenge killer that doubles as one of the tier's most dangerous special attackers. Any Pokemon that is made ineffective by Xatu is not worth using, and many top tier Pokemon are hampered by their poor Xatu matchup. Its fast and powerful Psychic keeps many dangerous Pokemon in check, such as Kingler, Primeape, and Weezing. Every Pokemon in GSCNU is influenced by Xatu in some way, and Xatu's dominance over the metagame has led to Little Cup Pokemon becoming metagame staples due to their great matchup against Xatu, like Houndour and Magnemite. Kingler, a destructive and unwallable offensive Pokemon, goes from being overpowered to relatively tame due to its poor matchup against Xatu. There are so many examples of Pokemon being influenced by Xatu, and I will try to cover most of them throughout this analysis. You know a Pokemon is dominant when it uses super effective hidden powers just to hit itself, which is a matchup that can decide entire games. Xatu isn't the perfect Pokemon, of course, and its status as the god of GSCNU is being mildly challenged by Octillery, but it is impossible to deny Xatu's impact on the metagame. It is a good kind of dominant Pokemon. Sure, it's used on 80% of teams, but it keeps the metagame stable and its flaws hold it back from being overpowered. Without further ado, let's analyse Xatu's role in GSCNU. By looking at Xatu's stats, you get a pretty clear indication of what it does. Xatu is a fast and powerful special attacker in GSCNU, using its excellent special attack and stab Psychic to pose a dangerous offensive threat. Psychic is scarcely resisted in GSCNU due to a scarcity of opposing Psychic types, Dark types, and Steel types. Aside from Xatu itself, the only viable Pokemon that resist Psychic are a trio of Little Cup Pokemon, Magnemite, Houndour, and Xatu. Psychic also hits many common Pokemon for super effective damage, such as Weezing, Gloom, Primeape, and Hitmonlee. Xatu's 95 special attack is very strong by GSCNU standards, letting it 3KO many Pokemon that aren't even weak to Psychic, like Statler, Chinchou, and Dugtrio. Xatu is one of the fastest Pokemon in the metagame, outspeeding already fast Pokemon like Magmar, Statler, and Hitmonlee. The 95 speed tier is easily the most important one in GCNU, because that is where Lord Xatu stands tall. Xatu is one of the premier spikes abusers in GCNU, using the chip they provide to further its offensive assaults and become much better at breaking through the likes of Octillery and Wigglytuff. Most flying types are not good answers to Xatu, so its checks are all hit by spikes and as a result shakier against Xatu. Spikes make certain 4 KOs against Pokemon like Magmar into potential 3 KOs, among numerous other damage calculations. Since Xatu is so fast, a Pokemon that wants to switch into Xatu needs to be able to take 2 Psychics in conjunction with Spikes up, which not many Pokemon have the ability to do. Xatu does have quite a few good checks, such as Octillery, Wigglytuff, Dugong, and Ninetales, but none of them are perfect answers. All of them bar Ninetales are slower, so they need to be healthy when switching into a Xatu with Spikes up. All of them are vulnerable to Psychic special defense drops and crits, and they can still crumble to a well-played Xatu with Spikes up. You have a lot of options with how you play with Xatu, since it can fulfill a lot of roles. You can use it as an early game wall breaker, revenge killer, late game cleaner, and even a defensive Pokemon, depending on how you play with it in games. Xatu's most common set is a Rest plus Sleep Talker, which Xatu uses to absorb status and make the most out of its defensive utility, or retaining high damage output. RestTalk Xatu was one of the best switch-ins to paralysis spreaders, like Gloom and Body Slam Hitmonlee, since it can just shrug off the paralysis whenever it pleases. RestTalk allows Xatu to stick around until the endgame, which is where Xatu most shines, since everything is all weakened and it can just pick them off with Psychic. After Psychic, Rest, and Sleep Talk, Xatu has to make an important choice. Hidden Power Ice or Hidden Power Electric. For context, a hidden power that hits opposing Xatu super effectively is all but required on RestTalk Xatu, since otherwise it just gets walled by opposing Xatu. Hidden Power Ice and Hidden Power Electric both fulfill this purpose, but they both have unique advantages elsewhere. Hidden Power Ice has the better DVs between the two, and it vastly improves Xatu's matchup against Dugtrio when Xatu is resting. Both Psychic and Hidden Power Ice do solid damage to Dugtrio, and they both hit its sub, so when Xatu is using Sleep Talk, it has the highest odds to pull a damaging move against Dugtrio. Meanwhile, Hidden Power Electric does slightly more damage to water types than Psychic would, and it gives you a guaranteed good Sleep Talk pull against water types when resting. Since Octillery is so common as a Xatu check on offensive teams, Hidden Power Electric can really help in that matchup. Hidden Power Electric also makes you worse against Dugtrio, however, and its DVs are slightly worse than Hidden Power Ice's. In the end, choosing between the two is choosing whether you want to be better against Dugtrio or Octillery/Dugong, and it can often come down to your team. For example, Hidden Power Ice is preferred if Xatu is paired with Chinchou, since Chinchou counters the water types that you want Hidden Power Electric for. Likewise, Hidden Power Electric is preferred on teams that already have Dugtrio checks, like Ice Beam Octillery or Execute. Hitting opposing Xatu is still the main reason both moves are used, since Xatu commonly wars with itself and not having coverage for it is very bad. Hidden Power Xatu wars can be incredibly important and game defining, since one player often loses their Xatu in the duel, which can be game changing. Drill Peck used to be common on RestTalk Xatu, but it has fallen out of favour as people realise how bad it is for your Xatu to be walled by the opposing one. Most of Drill Peck's coverage is redundant with Psychic, anyway. Xatu can also drop RestTalk and use tricks like Thief and Haze, but these sets lack the longevity and defensive utility of RestTalk sets, and are much harder to fit on teams as a result. Another thing that makes Xatu so dominant is how excellent it is as a revenge killer. Due to its speed, scarcely resisted stab, and power, Xatu is a universal revenge killer. Xatu is solid at revenge killing almost the entire tier, but it is particularly notable against offensive Pokemon, like Statler, Weezing, Kingler, and Primeape. Xatu's fast and powerful Psychic is one of the few ways of keeping these Pokemon in check. Xatu is excellent at sticking around and picking threats off thanks to the longevity of its RestTalk sets. Xatu is also one of only two Pokemon, with the other being Magmar, that can outspeed and 2-KO the dangerous Kingler, who otherwise destroys literally everything. The only other Pokemon that can compare to Xatu as a revenge killer is Dugtrio, and speaking of Dugtrio, that brings us to the defensive utility that Xatu provides. Xatu has a key immunity to ground, which makes it one of the few Dugtrio checks and a solid pivot into earthquakes and hidden power grounds. This also provides an immunity to spikes, making it even tougher to wear its RestTalk sets down. While Xatu's bulk is not fantastic, it does avoid being 2-KO'd by most common attacks, and its high speed make it solid at using Rest in dire situations. Xatu also has resistances to fighting and grass, letting it check Pokemon like Primeape, Hitmonlee, and Gloom. Despite its bulk, Xatu can be much more difficult to take down than you would think, due to its immunities and resistances. A lot of the Pokemon that can break through Xatu are also shaky switch-ins at best, like Statler. Xatu plays a key role on every team it is used on, which is to say, almost all of them. Xatu is commonly used on literally every playstyle in the metagame, ranging from Spike's offense, to Houndour Power Spam, to bulky offense with 9 tails, to stall, to all forms of Baton Pass, and yada yada yada. It is most famous on the Premier GCNU playstyle, however, which is a style named after Xatu itself. That's right, I am talking about Xatu plus Dugtrio Spikes, the most consistent, easy to use, and reliable playstyle in the metagame. Throw on Xatu, Dugtrio, Octillery, Pineco, and whoever the hell after. Xatu and Dugtrio pair very well together, with both complementing each other offensively. They both beat the things the other can't, and provide insane revenge killing potential to the team. It's incredibly easy to spam and build Xatu plus Dugtrio spikes, which is why it's so dominant. There are several other Pokemon who pair well with Xatu. Chinchou beats the waters that Xatu hates. Thief uses like Magmar can help Xatu break through special worlds. Explosion from Pineco, Weezing and Sudowoodo can punch holes through teams for Xatu. And Flareon can pass growth to Xatu, making it even more powerful. Xatu provides incredible offensive, defensive, and revenge killing utility. No other Pokemon can provide all of this as well as Xatu can. By just putting Xatu on your team, you get this offensively potent revenge killer that acts as a safety net against almost every offensive Pokemon there is. This is why Xatu is considered too good not to use. By not using it, you sacrifice all this potential and then become weaker to threats like Kingler, Primeape, Gloom, and Hitmonlee. Xatu helps keep all these offensive Pokemon and more in check. It truly is the great gatekeeper of GCNU. Well, nowadays it is anyway. Oh boy, while Xatu has been the best Pokemon in GCNU for 3 years at this point, the periods before that were much less pleasant for the bird. The first iteration of GCNU was created around 2012, and was much different than the tier we have today. Pikachu, Haunter, and... who was the other one? Or whatever, it's probably not important. But anyway, yeah, they were all legal, and several staples in the modern metagame were not allowed, like Wigglytuff, Ninetales, and Weezing. You might be thinking, whoa, surely Xatu was grey here, yeah? Its checks in the modern metagame aren't around, and it was surely as top tier as it is today, right? The answer is... Oh, I just remembered who the third Pokemon who used to be legal was. It was Mr. fucking Mime. Okay, yeah, I'm done trolling. Xatu was hot garbage in the first metagame. Mr. Mime was incredibly dominant and overpowered, so why use Xatu over it? Mr. Mime is much more powerful, especially bulky, and it has a much better move pool. Mr. Mime itself also dominated Xatu with its common thunder sets. As a result, nobody used Xatu in the Mr. Mime metagame. It was, in fact, in GCPU. That is how bad it was. There was virtually no reason to use Xatu when Mr. Mime was so OP, so no one used it. I have heard Xatu was pretty overpowered in the old GCPU though, so at least there's that. In 2018, Mr. Mime, Pikachu and Haunter were all moved up to underused, and several NU staples dropped down to NU, including the now banned Raichu, Feraligatr, Poliwrath and Golduck. This was where Xatu first came into its own. While not spectacular in the Raichu metagames, Xatu was a very good Pokemon. With Mr. Mime out of the picture, Xatu was the premier Psychic type of the metagame, and there was actually a reason to use it now. While Raichu had a good matchup against Xatu, Xatu threatened the rest of the metagame pretty well. Xatu used Thief sets more commonly in this metagame, in order to steal Raichu's leftovers, which would make it less reliable at switching in. Xatu's Psychic was scarcely resisted, and it was one of the few Pokemon who could threaten Poliwrath and Weezing. By the end of the Raichu and Poliwrath metagame, Xatu was considered one of the best Pokemon in the tier, being an excellent special attacker that could threaten numerous top Pokemon. So much so, that when tiering discussions started to happen on Raichu and Poliwrath, Xatu was actually a point of concern. Raichu was almost certainly going to get banned by this point, and that would remove the best check to Xatu. Without Raichu, how would the metagame handle Xatu? Would they be able to handle it? Will we have to ban Xatu after banning Raichu? Well, people just had to hold their breath and see, because Raichu, Poliwrath and Golduck were banned in late 2019, bringing us to the modern metagame. In January 2021, GCNU got a spotlight ladder, which was the first time the new metagame got serious play, and people very quickly realised that, yeah, Xatu was the best Pokemon in the metagame. I'm serious by the way, people knew Xatu was the king only like 3 days in. And 3 years later, it's still on top after many metagame developments. At first, however, Xatu wasn't thought to be as dominant as it is today. It was certainly the best Pokemon around, but it wasn't considered mandatory at all. NU Xatu was considered much less dominant than the dominant Pokemon in other GSC tiers, like Snorlax and OU and Nidoqueen and underused. As the player base continued to play throughout 2020 though, they realised just how good Xatu really was, and people started to consider it too good not to use. This thing had so much offensive and revenge killing utility in one slot, and nothing else could match how consistent and dominant it was in games. This is also when people stopped using Drill Peck on RestTalk sets and began using Hidden Power Electric, which eventually shifted to Ice, and then shifted back to Electric, and nowadays it's like the same amount for both of them. By GSCPL 1 in late 2020 and early 2021, Xatu was used on over 80% of teams, and it was clearly the most dominant Pokemon in the metagame. 2 years later, and it still holds that title. Octillery has, however, challenged it for the top spot of the tour, and joined it in S rank. Xatu and Octillery are the two best Pokemon, and they clearly run this metagame nowadays, but it's still harder to argue that Octillery is better than Xatu. To end this off somehow, I'll go over Xatu's few flaws, because while it is dominant, it is not flawless. The immense dominance of Xatu has led to Pokemon like Magnemite and Houndour becoming popular, who both easily take advantage of Xatu. Houndour in particular hard counters Xatu, and heavily damages it as it switches out with Pursue. Xatu can also struggle to break through common walls, like Octillery, Ninetales and Wigglytuff. Sure, it can hacks through them, but relying on hacks to break through something is not exactly reliable. Most teams will use at least 2 Pokemon with a solid Xatu matchup, which can make it difficult for it to contribute to games on occasion. Xatu's bulk is also not amazing, and it is weak to common attacking types like Ice, Electric and Rock. A majority of the tour can 3KO Xatu with their neutral attacks. Xatu also faces some mild competition from Fearow, who is basically just the physical version of Xatu. While Fearow is easier to wall than Xatu, and it isn't as good a revenge killer, Fearow's attacks hit quite a bit harder than Xatu's do, and it is even faster than the Psychic Bird. But all of that barely detracts from Xatu. It is simply too good at what it does and shapes the metagame to such an extent that it's really hard to dispute its number 1 status. If you ever decide to play GSDNU, build with Xatu, use Xatu, and be prepared for opposing Xatu, because if you aren't, then you will lose.